All right, hi everybody. I want to make sure I had all my technical details figured out, but it looks like all is well. So I'm really honored to be able to be part of the Caretakers series. Some of you folks may know me from my work with the Civil War Photo Sleuth website, or perhaps from some of the columns that I write for Military Images magazine. But I don't get to talk too often about my own collecting, and I really am looking forward to sharing some of the pieces in my collection with the rest of y'all. So my collection has kind of an interesting theme to it, or story behind it, if you will. I don't really have a particular theme other than I really try to identify unknown photographs. And as I've become more and more interested in this project, it's sort of shaped the kinds of items that end up in my collection. So to give you a little backstory, when I became interested in Civil War photos, and in particular identifying unknown photos, I would often be watching online auctions, and a photo would come up unidentified, and I would do a bunch of research while this auction was still going, and if I figured out who the soldier was, then I would end up trying to contact the seller and explain to them, hey, you're selling this photo unidentified, but I know who it is. Here's the name, here's another photo of this person, here's the backstory. You know, you should definitely update the auction or end the auction, and then you can sell this with a lot more information and a cool backstory. And to my surprise, I found that very often I wouldn't really hear anything from the seller, and the seller wouldn't update the auction. They wouldn't end the auction and relist it with the name and the backstory. And I found that surprising. Beyond the value that it adds from a historical perspective, it adds economic value, but for whatever reason that wasn't working, and so I became frustrated by that, and I realized that maybe if I just buy these photos, I can attach these names and stories to them, and at least I will be able to do something with them. Maybe I will somehow be able to keep that name and story with the photograph. And maybe at the time I was thinking I was going to resell these, but for the most part I ended up not reselling very many of them. I guess once I go through the process of researching them and trying to figure out who they are, they sort of, I don't want to get rid of them. I care too much about the stories behind these folks. So I ended up keeping a lot of these images, and so the theme of the collection is really the photos that I've identified over the years. And it turns out there's certain kinds of Civil War photos that are a lot easier to identify than others, and those tend to be, for the most part, photos of Union soldiers, especially officers, are a lot more likely to have photos of themselves in multitudes that were, handed out or given away during their lifetimes, and maybe one ends up ID'd in some collection somewhere, and so the odds of identifying them are a lot better. And so those types of images end up in my collection a lot. Images with a lot of interesting visual details that provide clues, uniform details, rank insignia, unique, at least identifiable clues like regimental hat brass or company letters or things like that. Photographers' back marks, of course, are wonderful clues to try to narrow down the locations where the photos might have been taken. And even unique faces turn out to be really useful. If a guy has a generic face, your odds of being able to ID him by matching him to another reference photo are low. But if he's got a unique face, and if you see something pretty similar to that, then your odds are a lot better at making that firm ID. So a lot of the images in my collection kind of are soldiers with unique faces, and they just kind of draw my attention, I guess. So that's the introduction to the collection. Let's get into the images. So here's one image that has been in my collection for a while that I'm a big fan of, and you may have seen a little bit of this story in one of my military images columns. But I love this carte de visite. I should say, by the way, that all these images are going to be cartes de visite. Those just happen to be the ones that I collect. Well, I shouldn't say just happened, because those tend to be easier to identify in some ways as well. The fact that you make the photographer would make a half dozen or a dozen copies at a time means that the odds of finding at least one of those identified somewhere are a lot higher than they are, of course, for the unique hard images. So at any rate, that's what you're going to see today. This image I really like. I really like the artistic quality of this portrait. Really nice contrast, and you can really see all the details of the soldier's uniform. You can see the braid on his kepi. I really like this decorative table that's kind of unique. And he's got, as I was talking about earlier, he's got a unique face, I think. He's got the mutton chops and just kind of an interesting face. So when I got this photo, I got it unidentified, and I just thought it was cool, and I hope that one day I'd be able to figure out who it is. And it took a few years, but I finally did. And this is the story that you might recall from the magazine. But as you can see, there's a really great backmark here as well from these photographers in Glens Falls, New York, Crandell and Conkey. And I recalled that unusual name, which I could eventually brought up in an internet search from another photo I had seen earlier that Ron Coddington had written about. This is Captain Barnes of the 93rd New York, and he is also photographed by Crandell and Conkey. And you can see they kind of have a particular style. They have these dark backgrounds and the very contrasting uniforms and dramatic poses. Different props, furniture, I guess, but otherwise pretty similar. So by figuring out that this photographer photographed at least one officer from the 93rd New York, I thought there might be some more. And it wasn't a guarantee, of course, but it was a place to start. And so I started looking for images of other 93rd New York officers, and it turns out that they're pretty well photographed. I'd say one of the most photographed regiments that I've come across, a bunch of images in the Library of Congress. And so looking through these group photos, I found Captain Barnes. You can see him there in the middle, but also a guy that looks a whole lot like the mutton chopped officer that I was trying to identify over here. And so once I figured out, all these images are nicely labeled, Company A, Company B. Once I found a similar looking guy in these group photos, then I was able to find the company and then look through the images of soldiers from that company and ultimately find another photo of this officer whose name is William Ball, First Lieutenant. And I was really gratified to finally get his name after just purchasing the photo based on how cool I thought it looked. Here's another image I really like. You can start to see as well when in my collection I really like the full-length views of the soldiers, and I can see a little more detail and just get a better sense of who this soldier was. In this case, this image is a little unusual for my collection because he's an NCO, and most of the images, as I mentioned earlier, tend to be officers. They tended to have more photographs taken, their photographs were more likely to survive. But in this case, I was able to identify this unknown soldier who was not an officer. And at first glance, you may look at this and say, well, there's not a whole lot of clues to work with. He's wearing his Union frock with his first sergeant chevrons and lozenge, and he's got a cool, kind of interesting face, distinctive kind of furrowed eyebrows, and that's about it. But he does have a Augusta, Maine backmark, and that was luckily enough of a clue to allow me to use our Civil War Photo Sleuth website, and its face recognition technology really came in handy here. All I had was a unique face, a Union First Sergeant uniform, and this Maine backmark. And so by running it through the website and filtering it down to soldiers from Maine who were first sergeants at some point, I was able to find a visual match. And this turned out to be Thomas Clark of the 11th Maine, and he eventually was promoted to become an officer, as you can see from these other images. I think one of these is from HDS and one is from the Maine State Archives, which has a really great website with a bunch of photos of Maine, mostly officers. But what's cool about my image, I think, is that this was earlier in the war when he was still an NCO. And I think the photographer did a great job. You can see every wrinkle in the uniform, and it really jumps off the paper to me. Here's another of my favorite images that I also wrote about for military images, so you may recall this one as well. This was a photo that, again, when it came across my desk, I thought it would be pretty hard to ID due to the lack of clues. This one is, again, of course, a Union junior officer. We can't even fully make out his shoulder straps, but we can assume he's some kind of lieutenant or captain. And that's really all we have to work with. We don't even have on the back any kind of photographer's back mark. We do see a tax stamp, which is helpful, so we can date that to 64 to 66. And there's even a photographer's cancellation, and I'll get to what that actually says in a minute. But the photographer's back mark, I realized after looking at this closely, it was not on the back. It was on the front. So there was a blind imprint on the front of this image, which is tough to see in the scan, but in the bottom left-hand corner, if you look very carefully, there's some embossed text there that says E. Cotting. And that was the critical clue to help narrow down this soldier. So Edgar Cotting was a photographer from Illinois, and you can see his initials where he canceled the stamp, him or maybe his assistant, canceling the tax stamp on the back there, EC, and then the date, which looks like, to me, February 21st, 65. So once again, I had some clues here, not enough to identify the soldier, but a good place to start. It's some kind of Union lieutenant or captain, and he's likely from Illinois. So by running this through Civil War Photo Sleuth website, I was able to get an exact match. So that made things easy. That's the beauty, as I was talking about earlier, of doing these, of collecting these CDVs, is every once in a while you can find an exact match in another collection. And this one was identified to Thomas Whiting, or Whiting, I'm not sure, captain in the 89th Illinois. Now there's a little bit more to this story. Thomas Whiting was actually killed at the Battle of Chickamauga, and what's a little surprising about that is he was killed in 1863, but we have this photographer cancellation from what I believe says 65. So the theory that I came up with to explain this is I think this was a post-mortem copy that his family requested. And what I mean by that is the photographer may have kept the negative for this photo, but I think more likely is that the photographer actually made a copy, used his camera to make a copy of an existing photo that the family had kept of Thomas Whiting. And if you see this little halo in the top of the image, I think that's from the original. And so I think after he was killed, his family maybe wanted some more images to remember him by, and asked the photographer to photograph one of their existing copies and make some more. And I think they might have done that in 1865. So maybe a pretty interesting image by itself, but maybe a little bit more to that story too. Here's a more recent addition to my collection. I purchased this image from Jeff Krause, and it was unidentified at the time, but there were some nice clues, visual clues in this image. I love the pose. I think this soldier looks very impressive. He's got the folded arms and the intense gazing into the sunset look. And it looks to me like a pretty early war photo. The very plain mount, very plain backdrop, and the soldier's uniform also suggests he's perhaps early war. He's got the McDowell cap with the short brim, and if you look very, very carefully, you'll see that he has some insignia on his cap. He's got the cross sabers of a cavalry officer and a little number 1. So this one is pretty rich with visual clues. This one was a little bit easier to identify, but still a lot of fun. We know he's in a 1st Cavalry Regiment. He has the shoulder straps of a 1st Lieutenant, if you look really carefully. You can even see his sword peeking, his scabbard peeking out behind him by the posing stand. And then the photo backmark is from Whipple of Boston. I feel like almost all the photos I come across from Boston are from Whipple, or either Whipple or Black. But when we add all these things together, we've got a good candidate for a 1st Lieutenant in the 1st Massachusetts Cavalry. And when I ran a search on Civil War Photo Sleuth for soldiers who fit those criteria, I found a visual match pretty quick. And it's even possible maybe that these images came from this, or at least the top one came from the same studio visit. He's still got the hands crossed, the arms crossed. But this is a soldier, 1st Lieutenant Benjamin Cronenshield, and he was a member of a pretty prominent family in Boston, one of the Boston Brahmin families, like the Shaws and some of the others who were active abolitionists. And I think he had at least one brother who was also an officer in the Union Army. I think his name was Casper, and there might have been more, I can't remember. But this family was very prominent, and he was, as you can see, a rather early enlister in the Army, and I think a pretty neat image. So speaking of prominent Bostonians, this is an image that has a cool story behind it. This is one of few that I'll talk about today that are not that were not identified by me. This one was already identified. So a rare example of an image that I had in my collection, knowing already who the soldier was. And so obviously you can see this is Stephen M. Weld, and he was a member of another prominent Boston family, the Welds, who remained prominent, and in fact distant descendant of Stephen Weld was the governor of Massachusetts, William Weld. But this is his ancestor way back, and you can see him here as a young man. He was originally in the 18th Massachusetts, and eventually he was in another regiment as well. But the cool story behind this image, well, first of all, I really love the look of this image. We got the full standing view. He's got all of his accoutrements. Looks like he might have a McDowell cap as well with a short brim, but I can see the infantry hunting horn there, and of course the shoulder straps, the sash, the sword. I can see sword and scabbard, and the wrist strap, and all the great detail that you would love to see in these images. There's a fun additional story to this one. So if you can see on the back here, the handwriting is a bit faded, a bit hard to read, but it does say Lieutenant S.M. Weld, Jr., Aide-de-Camp, General Porter Staff. And underneath that date, which I presume is the date that the photo was taken, February 24th, 1862. So when I came across this image, I was curious to learn more about this soldier, and in doing some research I found that he had written quite a few diary entries and letters during the war, and some of his diary entries were collected and published in a book. And so with this particular date here that the photo was taken, I wondered if we could perhaps research what he was doing on February 24th, 1862, and just get a better sense of what was happening around the time that this photo was taken. And so I knew it was a long shot, but I was able to find a digitized copy of the book on the Internet Archive, archive.org, which is a great resource with a ton of free digitized books, including lots and lots of 19th century books, regimental histories, incredibly useful resource for doing photo sleuthing. A lot of the books you can even do text searches, so you don't have to read through the whole thing. You just type in a phrase and it'll tell you which pages those phrases appear, if any. But anyway, that's a bit of a tangent. On the Internet Archive, I found his published diary, and when I went to the late February entries, I found something really cool. On his Thursday, February 20th entry, he wrote that he went to Washington, D.C., and he went in to get some things for Captain Norton and to have my photograph taken. I think I have a very good proof, but shall not get it till Monday. Well, Monday is February 24th. And so I'm pretty sure that this photo is in the photo, or at least one of the batch, that Stephen Weld was writing about in his diary when he said that he had a very good proof and that he got this image taken in Washington, D.C., which is a nice, helpful clue because we don't have a photographer's backmark. And it's one of the few examples I can think of where a soldier is writing about getting his likeness taken, and we have the actual photograph that he's referring to. At least that's my operating theory. So I also really like group portraits. They're hard to come by, but when they do come across my desk, I really enjoy trying to identify them because they have lots and lots of detail and interesting clues, and they kind of require their own special approach to investigation because you have the presence of multiple soldiers and multiple lots and lots of different details. I've written about this image as well in Military Images, but if you haven't read those columns, this is obviously a group shot of a number of officers who don't offer a whole lot of clues as to their unit or their identities. It looks like a grouping of the top brass from some regiment. We see a couple of field officers with 2 rows of buttons, and at least one of them has the shoulder straps with oak leaves of major or lieutenant colonel, and a few other lower ranked officers kind of around them. And that's kind of it as far as the clues. We don't see any hat brass. We don't see any photographer's back marks. Didn't have a whole lot to go on here. But as you can see from the caption, I was able to make some progress. And it started by focusing on the field officers. I figured those would be the easiest to identify because, number one, they tend to be very well photographed. There always seems to be lots of photos of colonels and maybe less so for the lower ranked soldiers. But also they tend to have kind of unique faces, especially the guy on the right. He has kind of an interesting goatee and mustache. And so I went looking through a bunch of Colonels in Blue reference books from the esteemed Roger Hunt, which, incredible resources for finding images of Union colonels. And this turned out to be a guy named John Morrill he was the colonel of the 64th Illinois Infantry. And once I had his name and kind of through a visual match determined who he was, I had the unit, and that allowed me to kind of look for other images of the rest of these guys and try to match them. And so I tried to narrow down the time period where John Morrill was actually the colonel of this unit. He was not the only colonel. And so that helped define which officers would or wouldn't have been photographed with him. And I had a couple of image references to work from. One collection was the Boys in Blue collection from the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library, and the other was collector Mike Cunningham was kind enough to share some of his identified images of the 64th Illinois. And so through that process, I was able to tentatively identify 5 of the 6, and I was feeling pretty good about that for a while until I ran into a problem with this guy here with the full beard. So my working assumption is that this was a officer named Michael Manning, and that is based on an inscription on the back of his CDV in the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. You can see Lieutenant Colonel Michael W. Manning is written there. But that turned out to be an incorrect ID, and I was able to figure that out when another collector, Doug Segrillo, came across another photo of the same guy, another carte de visite of him, and that had a period inscription identifying him as Dr. James T. Stewart, who was actually the surgeon of the 64th Illinois. So once I had that pretty rock solid evidence that this soldier is James T. Stewart, the surgeon, there is kind of a domino effect where I realized that this couldn't be Michael Manning, and if that wasn't Michael Manning, I was kind of using his service record and the years that he served in the unit as a lieutenant colonel to kind of as important evidence in identifying the other soldiers, and so it just goes to show there's no fully reliable source. You might think, all right, an inscription, Abraham Lincoln Library, this is pretty reliable. It's in a curated, collection, but I learned the hard way that's not always true, and I think the period inscriptions like the one on this James T. Stewart CDV are really the gold standard. So lesson learned. For me, anyway. One more group portrait that I really love. This one was a gift that I received, and it was a fun one because it had an inscription and a bunch of interesting clues and details, but the mystery wasn't totally solved, and so it gave me an opportunity to do a little more sleuthing, but I had a bunch of hints to get me started. So the image, as you can see, it's got a grouping of 4 Union officers. They are wearing the Russian knots that were sometimes worn by light artillery officers. in place of the shoulder straps. I think is a pretty cool detail. You can see some of the officers, their coats have a whole heck of a lot of buttons, way more than the standard. And at least a couple of them have kepis. One of them, I think you can barely see the crossed cannons of the artillery. In theory, those Russian knots would have rank insignia visible on them to help rule out, determine if it's a first lieutenant or second lieutenant or captain, but you just can't make it out in the CDV, unfortunately. And the back tells us that this is from Philadelphia, O.H. Willard, and we have some tentative IDs here: Charlie, Tom, Captain Eaton, Lieutenant Moore, Camp Barry, Washington, D.C. So the easiest one there, of course, Captain John Eaton. He's identified right there in the inscription from the 27th New York Artillery. And the hard part was trying to figure out who these other guys were, Charlie and Tom and Lieutenant Moore. And so by figuring out what were the years that John Eaton was commanding this battery, which I think was the whole time, so that didn't help narrow that down things too much. I looked at the variety of other officers who served. I think Lieutenant Moore was pretty easy to figure out, but Charlie and Tom were a little harder. And Tom turned out to be a nickname for an officer with a totally different name. I can't remember what it is right now, but he mentioned that in a letter that he wrote that's in a museum collection now. And if it wasn't for the fact that he mentioned his nickname, Tom, I don't think we would have ever figured out who he is. So it kind of speaks to the value of looking at letters and other written period materials to try to solve these mysteries. So that was a fun one. Feel bad I can't remember the guy's name, but it was definitely not Tom. All right, so I've been showing lots and lots of Union officers, and I kind of gave a little bit of an excuse for why most of my images are Union officers. I think another reason would be the fact that Confederate CDVs are a lot harder to come by, but I do have a few in my collection, and there's some fun stories behind them as well. So this image I actually found in an antique shop in New Orleans, and it was in a shoebox with a bunch of other photos, and it was one of those situations where the box is in a locked display case and you're wondering, is it really worth going up to the front and getting the person at the front desk to come back and bring the keys and unlock it? Is there really going to be anything in there? But my friend who I was with convinced me to give it a try, and I'm really glad I did, because it turned out there were several Civil War CDVs in that box, including several Confederates, which of course I immediately snapped up. So this one you can see here is a wonderful seated view of a Confederate major, and he's got the double breasted coat. He's got the sleeve insignia, and if you look very, very carefully around his neck is a tiny crescent symbol, kind of where his cravat would be, which is the symbol of New Orleans. And I wasn't totally surprised to see that, because I did buy it in New Orleans. So my working assumption was it would have been a Louisiana officer, but that little detail helped to firm up that hypothesis. And you can also see, of course, there's a really nice backmark of this image from the very well-known Richmond photographer Charles Reese. And I had heard plenty about how collectible Reese images are, and mostly seeing hard images from Reese. But this was the first CDV that I'd seen, and I thought it was especially cool to see the back mark there as well. So I'm especially so given that this photo was had the Richmond back mark, the crescent was a helpful clue not to necessarily start looking at Virginia officers. So I brought this one home, and I started researching all the Louisiana officers that I could find, and especially ones who were majors, as we can see from his star on his collar. And eventually I found some visual match in HDS of a post-war image of a guy that looked a whole lot like him, Major Alexander Hart of the 5th Louisiana. But it was a post-war image, and that's always risky. You know, people's faces change, and you really just can't do that really detailed, fine-grained comparison. So it was kind of tentative. But then, after I had kind of made this tentative ID, I realized that I had been missing a really valuable clue that was in the original image. And that was an inscription, very, very faded, barely visible inscription on the back of the photo, which I had missed despite taking in the back mark with all that excitement. I had totally missed this inscription because it had faded so much. So I've increased the contrast here, and maybe you could read it now. But it says Major A. Hart, so that is Alexander Hart, and that was pretty exciting to see. I had the tentative ID, but now I've got the inscription, the period inscription, to solidify that. And there's actually a date here for this photo as well. This is February 15th, 1864. I did a little research, and he was on furlough in Richmond around that time. So this date does make sense with the back mark. But another kind of cool detail here is that I was in New Orleans for a birthday trip, and my birthday is actually February 15th. So it seemed like an eerie and kind of wonderful coincidence that this photo was also taken on February 15th, my birthday, but in 1864. So this was a really cool find. Alexander Hart is a really interesting military record. He commanded even though he's a major, he commanded the 5th Louisiana for a good while. He was wounded several times. He fought at Gettysburg. He survived the war, and he is one of the more prominent Jewish Confederates. And he is kind of well known for that aspect of his life as well. So in the same grouping where I purchased this at the antique shop in New Orleans, I got a few others, including this amazing image. And this lovely pair here remains unidentified, unfortunately. Hopefully one day I can solve this mystery. I haven't solved it yet, but meanwhile I'm just really glad to be able to see the image. The soldier has his double-breasted Confederate officer's frock, and his collar suggests that he is probably a second lieutenant, and he has the tinted cuffs, which are dark, and that can mean a couple of different colors from the photographic techniques at the time. So I wasn't sure exactly which branch that might refer to, but when I looked really, really closely at the detail of his uniform, and specifically his uniform buttons, I sort of tentatively concluded that the buttons had script text on them, and that they were letter A's. So I tentatively think that he is an artillery officer, and this was purchased in New Orleans, so of course the first thing that comes to mind is maybe Washington artillery. I've looked through all the portraits I can find of officers of the Washington Artillery, and I haven't found a match. So I think that'd be wonderful if it was true, but I haven't been able to make that connection just yet. And of course, he's with his very striking wife or girlfriend, and every time I share this image, I think people are amazed by just how attractive this couple is, especially maybe by our modern standards. So I think it's a really neat image, and I was very glad to find it. So I'm going to go through a few images that I found identities for that were easier to solve because I was able to find an exact copy identified in some other collection. So they didn't require quite as much sleuthing, but nevertheless I was really happy to make an ID for these unknown soldiers when I came across them. So this one jumped out to me for two reasons. One is I love the composition of the image. I guess those dark backdrops always stand out to me, but I think this one looked particularly nice. Great contrast with the uniform. The photographer really captured all the details, and you can see all the folds of the clothing, the hat cord, and he's got a nice kind of intense gaze and a unique face, I would say. And the other thing that stood out to me was the Tyson Brothers Gettysburg backdrop. I've never had a photo from Gettysburg in my collection, and I got excited to have this one. With a little bit of research, I was able to find an exact copy of this image from the Emmitsburg Historical Society, and not only did they have an exact copy, but they also had an ID for this officer, and he's First Lieutenant William Horner, and he's a member of the 1st Potomac Home Brigade. So he's actually from the Gettysburg area, and so there's another Gettysburg connection there. In fact, some of you might be familiar with the Horner farm, which is in the area, in the vicinity, and that's connected back to him in that period of time. So this image just has a whole bunch of interesting Gettysburg connections, and it was great to be able to figure out his ID. This image is one of the first photos that I ever identified in my collection, and again, it doesn't really jump out to you at first glance. It's actually the photographer kind of missed the boat on this one, I'd say, because the soldier's face is kind of blurred. It's washed out. It's very difficult to see the detail of his eyes and nose. But what drew me to this image was that I was able to identify it very quickly. This was for sale online, and I just used a Google reverse image search and found a very similar image of this same soldier, an exact copy of the CDV on a website, and it was ID'd. I think it was a website that focused on the 12th U.S. Infantry, and it turns out that this soldier, Second Lieutenant Charles F. Van Duzer, served in the 12th U.S. Infantry, and he has an interesting story. He was a member of a prominent New York family, the Van Duzers, and he actually served in the 7th New York Militia, the famous Silk Stocking Regiment that many of the prominent New Yorkers and other soldiers from famous families like Robert Goldshaw served in. So he was in the 7th, and when that unit mustered out, he actually joined the regular army, which I can imagine was probably a big and unorthodox decision for somebody who grew up quite wealthy in these prominent families. But he did. He joined the 12th, and that's where he was made an officer and photographed here. and he was actually killed in action not too long after that at the Battle of Gaines Mill. His obituary actually ended up in the New York Times. I can probably attribute that to his prominent family. And here you can see kind of a poor attempt at an automated transcription of that New York Times obituary. But the key details are there. And I'll draw your attention to the last couple sentences here. At the something of the unfortunate battle, he was recovering from an attack of fever, but the senior officer being absent, he left the hospital to take command of his company, and while bravely leading them into the hottest of the fight or battle, he was shot through the head and died instantly. His popular manners and quick intelligence had won the admiration of a host of friends, and now that he is gone, even strangers who hear of his dauntless courage and devotion to duty will bestow upon his memory the passing tribute of a sigh. So some very Victorian, but I think laudable sentiments there for Lieutenant Van Duzer. And it's a lot of fun to ID this image. I did find that image, that matching image on this 12th U.S. Infantry website, but I wasn't quite sure where that ID had come from. Even though it was on the website, I wasn't sure if I should trust it. So I ended up writing to the folks at the Carlisle Barracks and the huge collection of Civil War photos from the Mollis Mass collection, and they had a photo of Charles Van Duzer there as well, according to their website, but it wasn't digitized. So I wrote to them, asked them to send me a copy, and they mailed me a copy that turned out to be this exact image again. So I had a couple of different forms of confirmation. Their version had an inked period inscription with his name, so I knew that was pretty airtight. Here's another soldier with a pretty impressive and sad war record. This is a photo that, as you can see, doesn't offer too many details up front. We see a Union junior officer. He's got shoulder straps, but we can't make them out. He's got, we can't really see any insignia on his hat. And he's got Washington, D.C. back mark, which is pretty much a dead end in terms of offering useful clues for narrowing down possibilities. But I got lucky with this one. This was for sale, I think, in an online auction as well. But I was able to find an exact copy of this soldier's image in the Minnesota Historical Society website. This one, I actually think this might have come from Wayne Jorgensen's website. So he's got a fantastic resource online for Minnesota soldiers, but you can see that there's an exact match for this one, who is Captain Joseph Piriam of the 1st Minnesota Infantry. Very famous regiment. They saw a lot of casualties in the Civil War, actually, but probably best known for their charge on the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg, where over 80% of the regiment saw casualties. And unfortunately, Captain Piriam was one of them. He was shot in the head and killed. And in fact, he sort of had a premonition that this would happen. He had written that earlier in the war that he was fully content that I shall never return from this war, and I'm entering the list with this conviction fully impressed upon my mind. I'm indeed proud of the privilege afforded me of offering up my life in defense of my beloved country. And he did, in fact, that premonition came true, and he did, in fact, lose his life in the service of his country. One more in the quick ID category. This is another image that I really enjoy. A very unique looking soldier. He's got this wonderful walrus mustache. Another nice standing view. He's got captain straps. No back mark at all on this one. Not a lot of clues to work with. But through a Google reverse image search, this one I think I used the Civil War Photo Sleuth website for. There was an exact copy of this same CDV on the HDS Civil War database. So that made things easy. This was Captain George Emmons of the 3rd New Hampshire. And you may know the 3rd New Hampshire as one of the regiments that was brigaded with the 54th Massachusetts during their assault on Fort Wagner. And I have not yet gotten a chance to go to the National Archives to look at his muster rolls and see if he was actually at that battle. But he at least served during the same time frame. So I like this guy. I think he has a cool look and perhaps a very interesting service record. So that kind of concludes my identified portion of the collection that I was going to share with everyone today. But I do have a few more slides of images that are unknown. And being so excited about identifying unknown images, I thought I would use this opportunity to try to crowdsource my unknown photos, at least a few of them, and maybe get some help from the broader community. Maybe someone will recognize one of these images, or at least offer some useful clues to help me figure out who they are. I buy these images when they stand out to me and when they seem to have clues like a unique face or insignia, or they just capture my attention and interest, and I don't want to let them go until I figure out who they are. So maybe you can help me with that. Here's a pair from the same photographer. This set stood out to me because I am a Pittsburg native, and they're both photos from Dabbs, who is a photographer in Allegheny City. And unfortunately, I don't know who either of these officers is. They're both junior officers. The guy on the left is a second lieutenant. The guy on the right is a captain. They both have very unique looks, so I feel like these are good candidates for identification. I feel like I'd recognize them if I saw them again in some other photo. But I haven't been able to figure them out yet. I've looked at other images from Dabbs, other units that he photographed. I know he photographed the 100th Pennsylvania and a few other Pittsburgh area regiments. And although I've looked through a lot of those ID'd images, I haven't found these guys yet. The one on the right looks like it might have had a tax stamp at some point, but I couldn't say that for sure. There's some kind of clue there. And these guys over here, I've grouped them together because they're both, neither one is an officer. They're both from the lower ranks. The guy on the left looks like a private, and the guy on the right, if you look very carefully, he's, I believe, a first sergeant. I've never been able to identify either of these guys, but I really love the details and the clues. The guy on the left, of course, as is made very clear by the inscription on the back, is a dead letter photograph, complete with the brass tacks and the red lettering. And he has a kind of somewhat unique shell jacket or private purchase jacket that looks similar to some Illinois units that I've seen that were also photographed in New Orleans, where this back mark comes from, but I haven't been able to figure him out yet. On the right, this guy just has all the great details that you could ask for in the uniform. He's got the sash, he's got his sword is drawn, his saber is drawn, and really cool backdrop that maybe somebody recognizes. Unfortunately, I don't have a back mark for this photographer, but it seems like a pretty distinctive backdrop, painted backdrop, and of course the soldier himself is pretty distinctive. He's got Looks like a little older than your average sergeant, but pretty neat looking guy. A couple more unknown officers that maybe you've seen before. The guy on the left, it's going to be hard to figure out. He's got a Washington D.C. back mark, but I think he has a pretty cool, unique look. And the photographer did a wonderful job capturing the details. You can see the little veins in his hand and each hair in his beard, and it seems like the soldier on the right you'll learn more about in my latest column in Military Images. I have a theory about who he might be, and you can see there's some clues penciled in on the back of this particular photo, but we still haven't quite narrowed him down definitively. There's been some, I think, wrong IDs, but the correct one remains to be seen. And finally, maybe you've seen either of these guys before. The one on the left drew my attention because he's got a William Shue San Francisco back mark, pretty neat. Looks like there's remnants of a tax stamp maybe, but he's a field officer with a kind of young and I'd say distinctive face, but we don't know who he is, and it sounds like looks like he was serving in the West, maybe at one of the forts in San Francisco. The officer on the right seems like he should be easy to identify. He's got Springfield, Massachusetts back mark. He's got infantry hunting horn and a regimental numeral, but we don't know. He doesn't show up in any of the reference databases for officers in this regiment from this state, and so maybe his true identity is out there, and one of you might know who it is and can help me out. So I think I'll end there, and with those questions, and I really appreciate you taking time to watch this and allow me to share my collection with you. I really appreciate the others who have shared their collections in the Caretakers series, and thanks to Doug York and Ron Coddington for inviting me to be part of this one. And I should also say thank you so much to all the collectors out there who have helped me with these IDs or just shared their photos or information about photos that have been so critical for me to learn the faces and names and stories behind the soldiers in my collection. So thanks a lot.